Hi, it's Mark. How you doing? Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and what I did, the decisions I made, and how I came to the point where I built a net worth of over $1 million in both real estate and mutual funds. So I'm really pumped to tell you about my background and so you learn a little bit about me. So let's get started. I was raised in Oklahoma and I had a really supportive family. They really emphasized hard work and learning. So I studied hard in school. That's where I got my first introduction to computers. I was working on the TRS-80 and the Apple II. And one thing I realized that I wasn't really a hacker. That term didn't really exist in my vocabulary at the time, but I would come to realize later that I really needed a book or a teacher to help me understand the computer. I wasn't great just fiddling around with the computer, going in, working on it, and figuring out how it worked. I came out to Southern California to go to college. I wanted to major in computer science. Unfortunately, I realized once I got out here that I'd applied to a liberal arts college that didn't have a computer science major. I was only 18 at the time, so my planning wasn't the best. So what I ended up doing was I ended up taking a lot of math classes, and most of the math classes that I took were computer oriented. But I didn't really want to be a math major, so I got an introduction to economics, and I really loved the finance aspect of economics, especially the personal finance part of it. So I ended up being a mathematical economics major with a lot of personal finance classes and a lot of computer classes on the math side. I combined that hard work and the love of personal finance. In my summer breaks, I would work, and then I took one of those summer checks and I opened up an IRA. That was my first exploration into personal finance. I was reading everything I could about personal finance. I had a subscription to a personal finance magazine. I belonged to a book club where I could buy business or personal finance magazines or books. And to me, personal finance seemed a lot like common sense, but from looking at where other people were in terms of their savings and in terms of their investments, it was obvious to me at that point that it wasn't all that common. The common sense that I thought was obvious wasn't all that common. I graduated from college and I started looking for a job either in business, banking, personal finance, investment banking, something like that, or in computers. And whatever career path I happened to land down first, whoever offered me a job really, that's what I decided I was going to go. Nothing really came up in terms of the business aspect. There was a lot of competition. It was really high dollar pay, so they were very sought after jobs. The problem with the computer jobs, they did exist, but a lot of them were with large companies who had large computer science departments, and they were really looking strictly for computer science majors. And as I said earlier in the video, I didn't have that. I had a mathematical economics degree, so those jobs were hard to come by as well. So what I did was I took a job in retail. I was selling flooring. It was a commission-based job with a minimum wage floor, but they really didn't want you to take that minimum wage floor. They wanted you to earn enough commissions so that you're above the floor. I didn't like the job. I wasn't good at it. Well, let's be honest, I hated the job, but it did earn me enough to pay the rent and buy food and stay out here in Southern California for about a year after I graduated. At that point, luck and networking really took hold for me. I had a math teacher that I really liked, who I took most of my computer classes for. As it turned out, an alum from my college also had him and really liked him. And that alum went back to my campus. He had just started a company fairly recently, and he was looking for warm bodies to help him take his projects to the next level. And so he asked his math professor if he knew anybody who might be interested. So my math professor said, yeah, I think so. And he called me and said, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, you bet I'd be interested. And so he set up an interview, and I went to this hotel and I met with the fellow alum. Honestly, it was the worst interview I've ever had. I didn't know anything. I couldn't put complete sentences together. I stumbled. I didn't know computer words. It was just a disaster. But somehow I got the job anyway, and my computer career was off and running. From that point, I took a lot of different jobs over the years. I worked in video games. I worked for the defense industry. I worked for business in terms of internet service providers, the automotive industry, the airline industry, just about any type of industry you can think of that needed computer work. I did a lot of it. Through all these jobs, I always contributed to some type of a retirement plan. In the beginning, with the smaller companies, they didn't offer 401ks. I put money into my IRA. Once I got to the larger, more well-established, bigger companies, I put money into the 401k regularly. And I always put in at least enough to get the company match, because that's free money, and who's going to turn down free money? I certainly wasn't. Additionally, whenever I would get a raise, it would typically be 3, 5, sometimes even 10%. I would bump up my 401k contribution by 1 or 2 percentage points. Then it eventually got to the point where I was putting in 10 or 11% a year. And the key to all this was that I never took the money out. I never borrowed against the money. I reinvested all of the dividends, so that was growing as well. And typically, I just let it be a passive income in a mutual fund that typically tracked the S&P 500. So it grew and grew and grew over the years. My real estate investments followed a similar path to my financial ones. Basically, decide what I wanted, figure out a path to get there, and then just let growth and time take care of the rest. I was still working at my first job right out of college, the first computer job, and I decided that I really needed to stop renting. For me, I looked at renting as an offense every single month when I had to write that check to my landlord. It was making him wealthy and me poorer, and I looked at it as literally throwing money down a rat hole, not helping me at all. So what I did was I went on an absolute savings bonanza. I spent basically nothing except on rent and food. I lived very close to my work, so I actually took a bike to work a lot of times. That allowed me to save about 50% of my take-home pay for a year or so. So I took that savings and I combined it with some creative financing from my mortgage broker, and that let me get into an FHA loan, which was insured by the federal government. Additionally, I got some help from the state government in terms of a first-time homebuyer program, and that let me buy a condo in Orange County, not too far from Disneyland. That purchase was a springboard toward all of my future real estate purchases, because then part of my payment was going to pay down the loan that was making me richer. Part of it was also going towards interest at the rate of 8.55%, if you can believe it. And part of it was also going toward property taxes. So those property taxes and the interest were tax deductible. Not like my rent payment, of which none was tax deductible. So the first thing I did was I changed my allowances at work so that I was getting more of my paycheck every month. Fewer taxes were being taken out. That allowed me to get that tax deduction twice a month with every paycheck, rather than once a year in a big tax refund when I filed my taxes. Once that happened, I increased my savings and immediately started looking for my first rental property. I kept looking in the ads, newspapers, flyers from realtors, anything that had to do with Southern California real estate, but I realized pretty quickly that the prices were simply out of my range. I had done everything I could just to get into the condo I was living in, but that was a personal residence, so I got better financing, and of course I used up the first-time home buyer programs that I was no longer eligible for. Luckily for me, about this point, a couple of brokers from Arizona started doing seminars in Southern and Northern California. Specifically, they were marketing to people in California who couldn't afford to buy in California but still wanted to get into the real estate market, specifically the rental real estate market in the Phoenix area. What they emphasized was the difference in Arizona versus California. Arizona is a very landlord-friendly state as opposed to California, which is a very tenant-friendly state. It's much easier to evict a tenant who's a problem or who doesn't pay the rent in Arizona than it is in California. And of course, they emphasized the difference in pricing. Prices in Arizona were about 1/4 of what they were in California. Additionally, since they were brokers, they could also manage the property. They could find a tenant for you and manage the property day to day, taking care of the expenses, fixing the property. So it was really a win-win-win for everyone. The broker who got paid, the tenant who got a nice place, and the landlord who got a turnkey rental right off the bat that cash flowed. So I held my breath, went to the bank, got a cash advance against my credit card, and put down 10% on a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the Phoenix area that I bought from the Veterans Administration. It was a foreclosure, and then I turned it over to the property managers, and they put a tenant in, and the property was cash flowing from day one. The tenant they put in was fantastic, the best tenant I've ever had. He stayed with me for 20 years, and there was never a problem. The only time I ever heard from him was when he paid the rent every month on time, or if there was a really big problem like the roof leaked or the hot water heater went out. Otherwise, all the small things, he just took care of himself. He was the perfect tenant. So with this new property, then again, all the mortgage interest was tax deductible, the property taxes were tax deductible. Any expenses that I had, such as fixing the water heater, fixing a plumbing problem, those were also tax deductible. But the benefit, since it was a rental property, is that the property was depreciable. So that was also another tax benefit. So what did I do? The same thing I did the first time. I bumped up the allowances on my paycheck again, so I was getting even more out of my paycheck, which still wasn't that big, but since I was paying less in taxes every 2 weeks, I gave myself a raise. The company didn't give me a raise, I gave myself one, and then I immediately started looking for more rental properties. The brokers that I had bought the first property from were still in business, so I went back to them and quickly bought 2 more properties. Both of those were foreclosures as well. One of them was, again, a Veterans Administration foreclosure. So all 3 of the properties were now throwing off tax benefits and positive cash flow. So that was a great start for me. At this point, I decided to diversify my holdings a little bit. I had only bought the 3 properties, and they were all in the Phoenix area. So I bought another property, again, a Veterans Administration foreclosure property. This one was in the Las Vegas area. Additionally, the second and third properties at this point had started to deteriorate a little bit. The neighborhoods weren't as great. I was having problems with tenants. They were just rough living and giving me a lot of expenses. So I sold both of those 2 and bought 2 other properties in a nicer neighborhood, blue collar, working class, right on the same block. Additionally, I had bought two fourplexes, two 4-unit apartment buildings from the brokers. They were in a pretty rough neighborhood on the east side of town, and managing them myself, because I'd gotten rid of the property managers at this point, was becoming a real problem. So what I did was I traded those two 4-unit buildings for two very nice properties on the west side of Phoenix. And additionally, the Las Vegas property was having similar problems. Las Vegas was a very transient rental market. People came and go a lot. It was very boom and bust. So it was hard for me to keep good quality tenants in there long term. They might stay 6 months or a year, no more than that. So it was just becoming a real headache for me. So based on that, I sold the Las Vegas property as well. I got really, really lucky in that I sold it right at the top of the market before the real estate market crashed nationwide. I would love to tell you that I knew the crash was coming and that's why I got out, but it's not true. I just got really, really lucky. However, once the crash did come, I did absolutely nothing. I didn't sell anything. I didn't buy anything. I just kept my tenants happy. I kept collecting that rent. And even though the properties were going down, I wasn't selling them, so it didn't really matter to me. I was still getting the rent, so that was good enough for me. Then when it looked like the crash was near the bottom, when things were really, really bad, I took that Las Vegas money, the money I got from selling the house in Las Vegas, and I bought two of my best properties. They were, again, blue-collar, middle-class neighborhoods, very nice. One of them was a property with a homeowners association on a golf course with a pool. The properties I've described so far, the 7 properties that I've talked about, became my core portfolio. I still have all of them today. They're all performing fantastically. I bought them in the range of $55,000 to about $80,000. Now they're worth between $225,000 and $275,000 each. So they've gone up about 4 times in terms of value. The rent has increased about 2.5 times. They're all bringing in about $1,200 to $1,400 a month. So that's my core portfolio in terms of rental houses. So far, I'm sure it sounds like it was completely smooth sailing all the way through. That's not completely true. There were a couple of hiccups along the way. The first was when I was trying to rapidly and aggressively expand the number of units that I owned. So I ended up buying 16 units on the west side of town. It was 4 fourplexes that were right next to each other on the same street. The problem was that I didn't do my homework. I trusted the selling broker. The situation was that there was a special deal with these properties that they had with the city, that the city would send tenants to these properties, and there was an exclusive arrangement between the city and this property. So the tenants who were on housing in the city had very little choice. This property was one of them. So I did ask the broker what happens when the contract ends. He told me that the city would continue to send me tenants. That was not true. Once the contract ended, the tenants were just like every other housing tenant in the country. They could take their voucher and go wherever they wanted, and they did. So then all of a sudden, I wasn't getting the 20% above market rent that I'd been getting before. I was competing with every other fourplex in the Phoenix area. So unfortunately, I ended up having to sell the properties at a slight profit. The financing wasn't great, so I didn't make a whole lot of money, but I did get out basically whole. But considering what I'd been hoping for when I bought the properties, it was definitely a disappointing investment. However, that was nothing compared to, again, what I was trying to do when I was trying to expand units. I'd been having no problem managing properties long distance in Phoenix, so I figured I could manage properties anywhere in the country. And I was looking for a unit, so I wanted something multifamily. I ended up buying a mobile home park in the Texas area. The problem was that I could get to Arizona easily. I could take a plane in the morning, Saturday morning, spend the day there, and come back Saturday afternoon. So it was easy to day trip. The property in Texas did not fit that bill. I could fly out Saturday morning, but then I would have to spend the night and come back Sunday afternoon. So I was gone pretty much the whole weekend. The problem was that I couldn't find anyone on the ground I could trust to manage the property and fix the units. I knew what I wanted to do. I had a plan that I still think to this day was good. I wanted to sell the mobile homes and only rent the spaces that the mobile homes sat on. So I'd collect a little bit of a payment from the tenants until they paid off the trailer, and then I would continue to collect rent from them for the space thereafter. That seemed like a great idea, and I thought, well, nothing can go wrong with dirt, right? You never have to fix dirt. There are no expenses there. Wrong. Because what I didn't realize was that I was responsible for the utilities. So when there was a big problem with the sewer line, guess who got to fix it? Yeah, it was me, to the tune of many, many thousands of dollars. But the bigger problem was that I couldn't get a maintenance man that I could trust to fix the trailers so that I could sell them. And it was so frustrating for this to me, because to this day I still think that if I could have just been there every week, that I could have gotten it done. I could have made the progress happen. I could see where I wanted to go, but I couldn't quite get there. So we ended up selling the mobile home park back to a previous owner. We definitely took a loss on that property. Unfortunately, that's the only property that my wife remembers. None of the other ones, only the mobile home park. However, I did still have my core portfolio of single-family houses, and as I said, they were doing great, so I decided to refinance 4 of those, take out some cash, and go in with a couple of partners to buy a 28-unit apartment building in my old hometown of Oklahoma City. But I did learn from the mobile home park experience, which was I knew I had to have this professionally managed. Now, it took 3 or 4 property managers to get one that I think is good, but I think we're there. I've said this before, but I really think that we're turning the corner and that we'll start throwing off cash flow next year. It hasn't been great so far because we've had to do a lot of rehab and fix a lot of deferred maintenance, but we are getting there. So I think we've increased the value by about 1/3. That's good. Additionally, we've paid down the mortgage by about $110,000. So if we wanted to sell the property now, we could make a nice profit out of it and get some decent cash back. But that's not our goal. That's not why I went into it. I went into it for cash flow, and like I said, I think by next spring we'll have a pretty good idea as to how the property's doing. What I've learned from all this is that the actions that I made years ago and the decisions that I made to put those actions in place are now coming to fruition. It's taken time and patience to let that process happen, but buying solid properties, putting in good tenants, and continuing to collect the rent and not being a buyer and seller has worked out really, really well for me. And that's how I was able to create 2 wealth pieces, over $1 million each, one in real estate and one in financial mutual funds. I hope that I've covered everything, and I think I've given you an insight as to the decisions I made and how I got to where I am today, the good and the bad of all of it. If you've made it this far to the video, then I hope that you would engage with me, leave a question or a comment below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.